everyone! Today I'm going to talk about my personal experience in the graduate program at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, and this has been a much requested video. As some of you may know, I made a 3-part video on my personal experience in the program about maybe approximately 2 years after I had joined the program, and people have been asked about how my perspective changed or if it changed over the years. And I have graduated from the program about a year ago, so I'm now an OIST alumni, and I would like to give you an update about what I think about the program now, the program in general, the pros and cons about joining. And since I would like for everyone who is looking for information on the Institute, I would like this to be the first video they see from me. I have unlisted my previous videos, however, if you would like to see them and see how I thought about the program about 4 years back, I have linked the videos in the video description down below, and if you click the links you can still watch the videos, it's just you can't find them through YouTube search any longer. So let me start with a disclaimer. This is about my personal experience. I am in no way any longer affiliated with OIST. I'm not representing in any way an OIST entity. I'm not associated with OIST. They aren't paying me to make these videos. I'm not representing any official OIST department, section, entity. There is nothing like legally that bounds me to the Institute any longer. And so this is all my personal opinion about the Institute. So yeah, just so you know, this is not a video that's affiliated with the OIST media section or anything like this. This is my personal video, my personal opinion, and yeah, please keep that in mind. Also, I will give a very broad overview about the program if you have never heard about it, but my information may not be up to date. As I said, I graduated a year ago, and around the time I left the Institute, there were a lot of changes implemented to the PhD program that I didn't follow too closely because I was leaving. So please take all information I give you on the program with a grain of salt and do your own research. And if I look down, that's because I have about 4 pages of notes, since I'm going to try to keep my thoughts at least somewhat organized for you guys. So what are we talking about? Well, we are talking about the graduate school program at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. And the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology is a pretty young institution on a remote island in Japan. So the institute was founded maybe about 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer by now. So it's a pretty young institute. And the vision of the Institute was to foster an environment where you can have a lot of collaborative research between different fields or within one subfield of science. And one of the ways they were trying to do that is by not having departments. So you still have kind of singular research labs led by a PI, but these research labs don't fall under departmental umbrellas, so you don't have any departmental boundaries. Those are removed. And the idea was that that would foster collaboration. In addition, the whole institute is built in a way where labs share office spaces, and you share kitchen spaces, and you share lunch spaces, so that people are going to talk with each other and get to know each other even if they aren't in the same unit. And the idea is that maybe you will talk about your research and you will see some similarities and come up with a collaboration. So that's the idea behind the institute. So where is it located? As I said, it's located in Okinawa, which is a remote island in Japan. So if you have Japan, you just keep going down south, till I would say halfway between like Fukuoka, which is like one of the most southern cities in Japan, like of Japan main island. So you keep going from there, from the main island, halfway towards Taiwan, and you're in the middle of this huge ocean, and you have a tiny, tiny island, and that's where Okinawa is. Yeah. And so that's where the institute is located. And then on Okinawa itself, you have like the biggest city, which is Naha, which is like kind of southern, but not in the south of the island. So it's in kind of the southern area. Then you have the north, which is really remote. And you have like the middle, and yeah, towards the south of the middle, you have Naha, and then you have a bunch of other bigger cities. And then it becomes more and more rural, and in the north, it's really, really rural. So the institute itself is located in Onna, which is like north of the middle, so it's already much more rural than any of the city areas. And it's about, I want to say, about 30-minute drive, 45-minute drive, depending on traffic and how you drive, to like the closest city-ish kind of area. So it is kind of rural. It is a very close, tight community. A lot of the students live on campus. So yeah, there is on-campus housing. So it is a very particular, special place where most people know each other, especially within the student community. And most of the time, everyone would help out each other, even if you aren't super close, just because you don't have many other people you can rely on close by. Many of the students and also many of the postdocs are international students or postdocs, and so they don't have family close by to rely on, and so you end up often relying onto each other. It is a 5-year graduate program, and in the first year you usually have 3 rotations, which means you stay with a lab for 4 months and do some research with them, and then you stay with the second lab and the third lab during your first, second, and third term. In your first year, we have 3 terms per kind of school year or year, academic year, 3 terms per academic year, and you are going to stay with 1 lab during each of these terms. In addition, you have to complete some coursework. It used to be that when you would come in with a master's degree, you would have to complete slightly less coursework, but I think that was one of the changes they did, and now everyone has to complete 9 courses and 3 rotations. And the idea is that during your rotations, you will find a lab that you like, where you like the research and everything else, and you can then join the lab. And so after you join the lab, you usually have some more coursework to finish, and you also start in your second year to develop a project for your PhD. And you then need to write a thesis proposal where you outline the project, you outline some of the preliminary research you have done, or some kind of research that highlights that you know the techniques that are necessary to complete your project. And you then write up this proposal in something called your thesis proposal, which is like, I guess, a 40-page document or something that outlines your proposed project and also highlights some work you have done that shows that you know the techniques, potentially some preliminary research on your proposed project that shows that the project is feasible. And then you do the research pretty much for 2.5 years. And then you write up your thesis, you defend your thesis, and you get a PhD. Easy, right? So here are some bonus tips since we are on this. Ideally, you should start to think about potential research project in your first year. So once you have an approximate idea which lab you would want to join or what you would like to do, you should maybe start to jot down potential projects and start reading the literature and start thinking about them, because, well, the second year goes fast and there are hard deadlines for when you need to have in your thesis proposal. And the second bonus tip of this video is start to write your thesis early. So yeah, whenever you do an experiment, write the method section right away as soon as you finish the experiment. Start to make the figures in a way that you could put the figure in your thesis, and just get started early on, because it will help you so much when the time comes when you have to write your thesis. All right, so now having these bonus tips off my chest, let's go and talk about what I think about the programs, what the pros are, what the cons are, what some things are that can't be quite classified. So first of all, let's talk about the funding. So the funding at OIST is, I want to say, sufficient. It's not great compared to other places in the US. It's equal or better to many places in Europe. And you should keep in mind when you see the amount of funding you're going to get that living costs on Okinawa are pretty cheap compared to other places, especially rent. And as such, it's enough to live off. So now, in comparison to Europe, grocery prices are pretty high, and you probably need a car in Okinawa, and if you don't have a driver's license, you will have to pay to get a driver's license, and it's not cheap to get a driver's license in Japan. We are talking like $2,000 to $3,000 US. However, the money is definitely enough to live off if you are smart. And if you don't have too many debts that you need to pay off. So yeah, it's definitely enough money, and on top of that, you do get subsidized housing. So you usually end up only paying around $100 in rent a month, and that's amazing, and that really contributes to like cheap costs of living. The other really nice thing about OIST funding, at least now still, is that they give you funding for one conference trip a year, so you can go to a conference of your choice. You need to have some research that you can present, and it has to be OIST research. So usually you end up with a situation where it's really, really hard to use this conference trip in your first year unless you go to a summer school. You also get funding for an educational visit, and this visit is usually to go to a different educational institution and to either foster collaboration or to talk to a professor at a different institution about their work and how it may relate to your work, or to present about the graduate program at OIST and like tell other students out there about the program, which obviously is very useful for OIST. Or you can do both of these things, like present about your research and present about the graduate school program and talk to a professor about their research. I have done a mixture of all of these during my educational visits, and usually it's only one day that you will be at the other institution and you can take as much leave as you want. So in the past, a lot of people have used these visits to visit their families, and they have found an institution that did some research that they were interested in close to their hometown or wherever their parents lived, and they would go and then they could take however many days they wanted off around that one day where they would stay at the institution that they were visiting, and they were able to spend some time with family and friends. However, it's not a home visit. I want to make this very clear, and you may just not be able to find an institute close to your hometown, especially if you come from like a place with less like scientific institutes in the area, or in general, let's say your undergraduate university was very far away from where your parents live now, and you don't have contacts to an institute close to where your parents live. You may not be able to find a professor that will agree to host you. It's always a good idea, if that's the case, to inquire with the international program to see if you could just come and give a presentation about OIST and promote OIST and OIST research in general. But you may just not be able to use it to see family and friends. So keep that in mind, and keep in mind that in general, since that can happen and you probably do want to go home once in a while, you should try to save up some money during the year so that worst case you can pay your own flight home. So yeah, but it is in general a very nice thing about OIST. Another amazing thing about OIST is the amount of support you get for moving there. So when I moved to Japan, I remember that there was very little I had to take care of myself. I think I had to go to the Japanese embassy and put in my paperwork, and then I had to go back to collect my passport. However, I had to fill out a couple of forms. However, the bulk of the paperwork was done by OIST, and also when I arrived at the institute, they put me up with housing for the first year. It's not amazing housing on campus, but it's not bad either. So I had a place to stay for the first year. They walked us through all the necessary steps in the first week, like that we got Japanese phones, internet, to go to the city office to like register with the city and like for healthcare and so on. So pretty much all you have to do is like, you have to go there, like fly there, and they will buy your flight too. So you will just get a flight ticket. They will pay for part of your move. Again, you don't have to do much. They will tell you which moving company you're moving with, and then you pack your stuff, they take it and send it over. So yeah, really, that's amazing. And even once you get there, so for us, obviously, back when I started, we were only about, 100 or 120 students or something. So our relationship with the graduate school office was often very personal, and the graduate school staff, they would know us by name and they would take care of us. I remember one year when I flew home, I got like a really important piece of mail with a bill that had to be paid right away. And I remember one of my flatmates found the bill in our mail and she brought it to the graduate school office for me. And one of the employees at graduate school offered me to pay the bill from her own private money and to have me pay her back once I get back to Okinawa, which was extremely nice of her, and I'm extremely grateful for this kind of support. Obviously, it's not quite the same any longer now. We have like maybe 200 or 300 students. I don't know how many there are. It's a lot, like a lot more than 120 nowadays. But you have a resource center that helps you with anything that's Japanese language related. They help you to read your bills, to phone up companies, to apply for credit cards, anything where you may need language support. And even if you go to graduate school with something that's not quite their cup of tea, let's say a bill you got, they will still help you translate it. But please go to Resource Center if you're aware that it's a bill, because it's not really graduate school job to translate your bills. And there's a whole section for it at OIST. So yeah, you have an amazing support network, which is really nice. Another thing is, as I said, you do develop your own project in your first and second year, primarily in your second year after you joined a lab. And depending on your lab, you may be more free or less free in like defining your project. But from my experience, a lot of people had a lot of freedom in coming up with their project. So they were able, as long as it was more or less within the scope of the unit's research, to come up with a project and to develop this project together with their supervisor and to then conduct the research. And this is amazing because you come up with a project that's really, really close and dear to your heart, and you then get the money and the support to conduct the research, and it's your project. It's not a project your PI wanted to do forever and you just ended up being the person doing it, but it's a project that you really, really want to do, and that will motivate you to work hard and to get the research done. So I think that's a really amazing point about OIST still. The other thing I do like about OIST, even though it does have its flaws, is the rotation system. So obviously having 3 rotations allows you to look into like different lab environments and see what may work for you or what doesn't work for you. And staying with the lab, or how they are called at OIST, with the unit, for a couple of months will give you a feel for the unit. So you are much better informed when it comes to the time where you have to choose a lab. You know how the labs feel, how the vibe was, and you can choose a lab that suits you and that does research you find interesting. The only downside is that you may end up rotating with units that don't actually have spots for students, and that is about the biggest issue with the rotation system that OIST has right now. A lot of the units don't have space for new students because they already have so many students, And you may end up rotating with 3 units just to realize that none of these units have spots. Or you may request rotations in specific units and they may not even be able to accommodate you for rotation. And so you may end up in a position where you come to the institute and you wanted to work with a unit, but they don't actually have a spot for you, or they can't even accommodate you for rotation, and you have to work in a different lab, or you really only have one lab that has spots free for students, like one lab in your field, and you have to join that lab and you don't have much choice. So I would really recommend that if you have a specific lab in mind that you would like to work with, or a couple of labs in mind, that you contact the professor or students in the lab and ask if they actually have space for new students. And also if you contact the students how the general atmosphere of the lab is, because just because you like the research of the lab, it may not be a good fit for you to go and work with that unit. And in that case, if there is only one unit or there are 2 units at OIST you want to work with, and either they don't have space, or you contact students and they tell you about how research is done in the lab and it's really not like how you feel comfortable doing your research, or how supervision is done, and that's just something doesn't work for you in terms of supervision, it's probably better to go somewhere else. But in general, the rotation system is an amazing idea in terms that you can sample some labs and hopefully end up with a lab that works for you. Another nice point about OIST is that they have specific rules in place to check on your progress ever so often. It comes down to a lot of work for the students, and in some points I think they overdo it a little bit, but at least you will meet with your thesis committee ever so often and make sure you are staying on track. The downside of these very regular checks, as I just said, is sometimes they overdo it, and sometimes the rules behind this whole thing are super unrealistic for a research environment, and then on top of that they are really inflexible. So let me give you some examples of these. So at OIST, all deadlines for everything when you need to have in your thesis proposal, your yearly progress reports, and your final thesis are the same across fields. So let's say you're an experimental neuroscientist like me, your deadlines are the same as those for theoretical physicists. So now I don't want to say theoretical physics is less hard or much more certain than experimental neuroscience, but the reality is theoretical physics generally gives you a lot more planning ability because you don't have to deal with very complicated experiments where a lot of things can go wrong. Of course, you may end up figuring you can't solve that equation you set out to solve in theoretical physics, and that's still an issue. But it probably doesn't cost you a year and a half like a failed experiment in neuroscience. So yeah, having these equalized deadlines across fields of course comes from the idea of having a collaborative institute without departmental boundaries, but it also sometimes makes it really hard for experimentalists, because even though I personally would say you have a lot more pitfalls in a PhD in experimental neuroscience than theoretical physics, you still have the same kind of boundaries and hurdles to get an extension for your PhD. Another thing is that often, even if you had prolonged medical issues, or let's say you had to change your lab because the advisor-advisee relationship between your supervisor and you really didn't work out, or you had other issues in your lab, it's often not accommodated in terms of giving you an extension. Of course, if you have medical issues and you have to take one term off, they will accommodate you by giving you an extra term in the end, but also your term off is usually unpaid. So you aren't on like medical leave where you are still being paid, but it's like non-study leave where you don't get any salary, and also you use your housing allowance, and usually you have to move out of your OIST housing. So really, if you run into any medical issues during your PhD, it's usually a huge issue at OIST. And let's say you don't want to take non-study leave because you don't want to lose your salary, or you just can't afford to lose your salary, and you don't want to lose your housing allowance, or you don't want to have to move out of your flat, you didn't take time off, so you don't get any extra time at the end of your PhD to finish your PhD. And one other example of like kind of unrealistic or inflexible rules is that you can't really take annual leave or do any kind of business travel in your 5th year. So the official statement is that you can't take annual leave or do any business travel after you handed in your thesis. However, realistically, you won't take leave or go on business travel while you are writing your thesis, because in general, your supervisor won't want you to leave on vacation while you're in the middle of writing your thesis. So then you hand in your thesis, and up from that point, the OIST rules forbid you to take any annual leave or go on business travel. So basically, your whole 5th year, you can't go on vacation, you can't visit your family, and you can't do any business travel to conferences, which is ridiculous, because in what year are you looking for a job? Well, usually in your 5th year, like the year where you finish your PhD. And so you want to go to conferences to network with potential professors that could give you a job. You want to go and do business travel to visit other labs, to talk with professors whether you could write a grant together so they can hire you, or whether they have open positions. And you may get invited to formal interviews, which also is business travel if you go. You just can't go. So how are you supposed to find a job or interview? And also, you probably will have the most stress during your final year. So you kind of want to take a break at some point, maybe? I don't know. I think that's a very unrealistic, ridiculous rule that they came up with. I understand that they don't want you to travel like the week or two before your thesis defense, because obviously Okinawa does have typhoons, also known as hurricanes in other parts of the world. And so, yeah, obviously you may, like, let's say you travel until the day before your thesis defense, you may not make it back in time because there may be a typhoon and all the flights are cancelled. So yeah, I think it's reasonable to have like some kind of no travel period before your thesis defense, but at the moment we have to submit, or students at OIST have to submit their thesis 6 weeks before the day of their thesis defense. So at least let them travel the months after they submitted or the 2 weeks after they submitted. It's not a huge time window, but it's enough to go home and see family or friends. It's enough time to go for a job interview. It's, you know, you get the idea. So that's, yeah, something that I really don't like about the OIST program, like how unrealistic some of the rules are. So to follow up on that, at least during my PhD, we had constant rule changes. So from what I know from where I'm coming from, which is Germany, the study constitution, or the like kind of the document with the rules for your study program, you have like a set of rules that you get when you enter the program, and those are usually the rules you graduate under. So even if they change the rules, let's say it's a 3-year bachelor program, and they change the rules and the graduation requirements in year 3 of your program, you would still graduate under the rules you had been given when you entered the program. So these rules are set for you and they don't change. Often you will be given the option to transfer over to the new set of rules, but by no means is this mandatory. So OIST, what they would often do is they would just change the rules, and they would say this rule change is for everyone up from now. So one example was that they changed the rule about thesis submission requirements, and all of a sudden you needed to have a submitted or published manuscript in order to submit your thesis. And while it is standard in many other places in the world that you need to have X published articles in order to submit your thesis or in order to graduate, that's not the case at OIST. So a lot of people end up focusing on their thesis, and they have manuscript drafts that they are about to submit as soon as the thesis is submitted. However, they may not have been submitted or accepted by a journal yet. So they made the change overnight, and you had people with thesis submission dates 2 weeks out who all of a sudden were told you need a submitted or accepted manuscript / article in a journal within the next 2 weeks in order to submit your thesis. Obviously, they faced huge backlash, and they eventually backpedaled and only implemented these rules for people who started later on and had more time till they graduated. However, rule changes like these were implemented over and over during the years, so you study under an ever-changing set of rules. From my understanding, this problem has been fixed in some regards, so there are now some rules that will not be changed during your time at OIST for you. Those are, as far as I know, your graduation requirements. So whatever graduation requirements you start with will be the graduation requirements you will graduate under. However, other things they cannot fix, and that's, for example, the financial support. So your financial support may change at any time during your time at OIST. And one example for me was when I started at OIST, we were still paid 1 domestic conference trip a year, and they changed the rules, I believe, in my 2nd year at OIST, and all of a sudden we were only promised financial aid for 1 international or 1 conference trip a year, could be international or domestic, but not for 1 international trip and 1 domestic trip, which is the set of rules I started under. So yeah, that's also, it's a bit of an issue because OIST, they had been promised funding from the government for the initial 10 years, and after that, funding will probably gradually decrease, government funding, and they will need to find funding from other sources. So that really means OIST already has experienced some funding cuts in the past years under government funding, but it will probably mean that OIST will experience further funding cuts in the years to come. And that really means, well, how much longer can they afford to promise funding to every incoming PhD student? Or how much longer can they guarantee to fund everyone who is already enrolled in the PhD program? And you may end up in a situation where your salary gets cut just because OIST experience funding cuts and they just can't afford to pay every PhD student as much as they pay them now. So let's say they cut your salary to 80% of what it's now. Let's say they cut every PhD students to 80% salary of what it's now. Well, you end up with a situation where the salary is still sufficient to live on, but you have to make very smart choices to make it work for you. And so really one of the questions is, how much longer will you get the funding that they promise you now? Will you get it during your full PhD, because they may change it at any time, and you are taking some risk there. So that's definitely one of the cons I see with doing your PhD at OIST right now. Another con that comes with these funding cuts is that you will usually experience a huge pressure to finish on time, because the last thing OIST wants to do, your supervisor wants to do, anyone wants to do is fund you for an extra year, given that money is kind of tight at OIST right now. I mean, it's still not as tight as it is at other institutions, and your supervisor may be able and happy to fund you for an additional year, but it's nowhere granted. So keep that in mind. There will be a huge pressure for you to finish on time and to just get stuff done. On the contrary to that, though, like, people at OIST and things at OIST kind of run at a really, really slow pace. So I recently moved to New York. I moved to NYU for a postdoc, and things just go faster here. Like, not necessarily administrative things, but research in general goes at a faster speed here. And I don't know what it is, but you're on like a remote, laid-back island, and yeah, obviously, I don't know, that kind of translates over to the institute, and everyone is pretty relaxed and things just go slower, and it's fine. You will graduate eventually, right? But you still have the pressure to get it done in 5 years, even though everyone else is super relaxed about it. And also often that means that you may not have published a single paper by the time you graduate, just because everything goes at a different pace and everyone is super relaxed, except for you, because you have to finish in 5 years. Ideally, you need to have 1 or 2 publications once you graduate. So that's also a bit of a con. The other thing that may be a pro or a con, depending on like your personality, your personal way of life, all of that, is the location of OIST, and also the kind of community you are getting in. So it is a really, really tight and small community, and you are on a remote island. So what does that mean? Well, the whole tight small communities thing means that it really feels like you are living in a tiny, tiny town. There is gossip, there is talking, there is all of these things. It is like you are living in a small rural town. And depending on how your personality is and so on, that may be something you love, because the upside is your neighbors will help you, people will help you, everyone will be friendly, and you're in a tightly knit community, everyone knows everyone, and you may love it depending on your personality. I personally hated it. I hated living on campus and being in this tight-knit community. It's just, I don't like small town living. I moved to New York now and I love being here. I haven't made friends yet because of the pandemic, but I still love the feeling of being here. So it really depends on your personality. The other thing is, as I said, it's a remote island and there are limited things to do. And again, if you love the ocean, you love to go diving, you love to go hiking, which by the way, I like to do all these things. I am an avid diver, I like to go hiking, I like to go out in nature. However, I also like to have a mall close by and be able to go to the department store and to walk through the city and to people watch and all of these things. But yeah, if you like, this Hawaiian laid back island lifestyle, you will probably love it. I didn't, but again, so that really depends on you. The upside is it's an amazing hub for travel. So I love traveling. For me, that was great. You have good access to Asia, you have good access to mainland Japan. Obviously, it would be easier to travel around mainland Japan if you would be in mainland Japan. But you have good access to Taiwan, you have good access to South Korea, you have good access to Thailand, which are all amazing countries in my opinion. So if you love to travel, for that, it's not a bad place. So really there are up and down sides with the location. There are some things that I would really, really rate as a con in terms of locations. And those are mostly scientific reasons. So one is, it's really hard to form collaborations. There are other universities on the island. However, often you would need to speak Japanese to collaborate with these universities. So if you speak Japanese, you may be able to form a collaboration with close by universities. But also there aren't that many universities close by that will necessarily do anything close to your own research. I think an exceptional exemption is marine biology. So I think there is a really good marine biology department at one of the other universities and people have collaborated. So it's not true across fields, but for some fields it will be really hard to collaborate just because you don't have 10 other universities close by that do research in a closely related topic. Obviously now I'm in New York and there are a bunch of universities that do really good neuroscience research very close by. And so it's a lot easier to set up collaborations. The other things are conferences. As I said, you have funding for one conference a year. But really, let's say you are in the US or you are in Europe, usually conferences are a lot closer by than if you are in Japan, because a lot of the major conferences are hosted either in Europe or the US. So most of the major conferences take place in Europe or the US, which means generally flights are a lot cheaper And so even, let's say you also have some kind of conference budget, you will probably be able to make it go further than you being in Okinawa. Plus, we don't have a conference budget. We get funding for one international conference. So let's say you're in the US and you have a yearly conference budget of 2,000 US dollars. Let's say 2,000 US dollars. Given that flights are so much cheaper for conferences in the US, you may be able to stretch it for 2 conferences. So that's like kind of a drawback, you being so far away. And apart from a budget issue, you have to take a really, really long international flight to most conferences. You will be tired, you will be jet lagged. It's not the greatest experience usually to be tired and jet lagged and then trying to stay awake for all the talks at the conference and to present your research. So in that regard, location really is a downside. And the last point is, obviously that carries over to your supervisors. So when they go to conferences, it's also a long flight. They may go to less conferences because it's such a long flight because of the cost associated with going to each single conference. And once they get there, they will also be jet lagged and tired. Obviously, they had a little bit more time in their career to figure out how to deal with these things, but they will still be jet lagged and tired, which means once they are at the conference, they may not have a lot of energy to talk with new people and make new contacts and form new collaborations. And that means at the end of the day, from my experience, professors at OIST have less outside contacts and collaborations than professors in other places. And I don't want to say this is true across the board, but I personally had the feeling being at OIST that a lot of the professors had less outside collaborators or contacts in the scientific community. So why should that bother you, you may ask? Well, at the end of the day, you need to find a job once you graduated, and if you want to go into industry, that's a whole different story. But let's say you want to stay in academia, a lot of people try to tap into their supervisor's contacts to find a job. So now obviously I found a job without that, I found a postdoc position without that, and it is entirely possible to find a good postdoc position without tapping into your supervisor's contacts, but it is a lot harder. Let's say you want to go to industry, again, you being so remote means you can't really network in person with companies during your time at OIST. Of course, there are other ways to network, and especially after the last year, we know that Zoom works great for meetings and also for networking and so on. But from my experience, it's still very different and a lot harder if you can't network in person. So yeah, location has a downside in terms of the contacts you can make, the collaborations you can form, the kind of opportunities you may have. So it is a bit of a downside. So yeah, I realized this is a really long video. I think these are all my thoughts on OIST that I have for now after graduating from OIST, and I was in the program for for 5 years and 3 months. So I graduated within 5 years and 3 months, and then I stayed at OIST for another 9 months. I was supposed to stay for an additional 6 months, but I got stuck due to the situation in the world last year and partly this year. And after having been at the institute for almost 6 years, or I think it were 6 years by the time I left, this is what I'm personally thinking about the program, what the pros are, what the cons are. And really, it's up to you whether you can live with those cons, whether for you personally the pros outweigh the cons. Everybody is different, everybody has a different personality, everyone has different research goals, and everyone has a different background. So yeah, really, it's up to you and it's your decision. This is just my personal experience, and I just think it's helpful to have a personal account to know what the pros and cons of a specific institute are, because let's be honest, every institution, every graduate program has pros and cons, and really it's up to you to decide which points are important for you and which graduate program fits best for you. So yeah. So these are my thoughts. I hope this is helpful for some of you. And I'm sorry the video is almost an hour. But yeah, I had a lot to say. There is a lot to say about OIST, and I hope this is helpful. So yeah, I guess see you soon. And enjoy the rest of your day or the rest of your night, depending on wherever you are in the world. Bye!